What happens when someone you love chooses truth over everything you taught them? In 2019, a woman named Allison Hayes told NPR that she could not watch her own daughter get married, not because she was estranged, not because she had done something wrong, but because the wedding took place inside a Latter-day Saint temple, and Allison no longer held a valid temple recommend. She had left the church. And in the world of Mormonism, that single decision meant she was not permitted to enter the building where her daughter was being sealed for eternity. While the ceremony happened upstairs, Allison sat in a carpeted waiting room on the ground floor, alone. That story is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most quietly devastating consequences of leaving the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because in this faith tradition, family is not just important. It is the entire architecture of heaven. Marriages are sealed in temples for time and all eternity. Parents and children are bound together by sacred covenants that are meant to survive death itself. The family is not a social arrangement. It is a theological unit, the very structure through which salvation is organized. As President Dallin H. Oaks declared at General Conference in October 2025, "We are a family church." He said the doctrine of the church centers on the family, and that the sealing powers exercised in a growing number of temples are real. "Let us be part of it," he urged. But there is a question that President Oaks did not address. What happens when someone in that eternal family walks away from eternity itself? What happens to the sealing when someone stops believing? What happens to the love? There is a conversation that no Mormon family wants to have. It is happening more frequently than church leadership would ever publicly admit. And when that conversation finally takes place, nothing is ever the same again. The moment of confession. The numbers tell a story that church leaders have tried to deny. In December 2025, Religion News Service published an analysis of data from both the Pew Religious Landscape Survey and the General Social Survey, and the findings were unambiguous. According to Pew, the LDS Church retained 70% of its childhood members in 2007. By 2014, that figure had dropped to 64%. By 2023, it was down to 54%. Roughly half of all people raised Mormon in the United States no longer identify with the faith. The General Social Survey painted an even sharper picture. Among millennials and Generation Z, 55% of those raised LDS have already left. That is not a slow erosion. That is a generational rupture. And yet, despite these numbers, the moment someone actually says the words out loud inside their own home remains one of the most terrifying experiences a person can go through in Mormon culture. Because the person who speaks up has almost always been carrying their doubts in silence for months, sometimes years, before a single word is ever said. It begins quietly. A question about the multiple accounts of the first vision. A disturbing discovery about Joseph Smith's polygamy that was never mentioned in Sunday school. The Book of Abraham controversy. The CES letter. Something cracks. The shelf begins to bow. But for the longest time, they say nothing. Because they understand what saying something will cost. In a 2023 survey conducted by Josh Coates and Stephen Cranny of over 1,000 former Latter-day Saints in the Mormon corridor, the top 3 reasons people gave for leaving were history related to Joseph Smith, problems with the Book of Mormon, and race issues within the church. These are not frivolous complaints. These are people who studied their own faith and found it wanting. And yet, 75% of those who left reported negative or strongly negative feelings toward the church as an institution, not toward the people, toward the institution. So the doubter waits. They sit through sacrament meetings feeling like a stranger in their own ward. They pay tithing on money they no longer believe is going where the church says it goes. They answer temple recommend questions with half-truths because the alternative is losing access to their own children's weddings. And then one day, the weight becomes unbearable. The conversation happens. "I have doubts." Or, more devastatingly, "I don't believe this is true anymore." What follows is remarkably predictable. Silence, then fear. Then a response that almost always takes the same form. "You've been deceived." "What did you read?" "Who have you been talking to?" The assumption, nearly universal among believing family members, is that this cannot be the result of honest inquiry. It must be the result of sin, of deception, of outside influence. Because if it were simply the result of someone thinking carefully and arriving at a different conclusion, that would mean the conclusion might be worth considering. And that is a door no faithful Latter-day Saint family wants to open. The machine behind the silence. What most outsiders do not understand is that the distance that follows a faith crisis is not simply a natural human reaction to disagreement. It is, in significant part, structurally produced by the church itself. Consider Temple Recommend question number 7. For decades, every Latter-day Saint seeking access to the temple, which means access to their own family's most sacred rituals, was asked, do you support, affiliate with, or agree with any group or individual whose teachings or practices are contrary to or oppose those accepted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Think carefully about what that question demands. If your brother has left the church and now openly discusses his reasons for leaving, affiliating with him, eating dinner with him, listening to him, treating his perspective as legitimate, could theoretically jeopardize your own temple recommend. The church revised this question in 2019, softening the language to ask whether you support or promote contrary teachings. But for decades, the original wording hung over every family interaction like a threat, and the cultural residue of that question has not disappeared. Then there is what Elder M. Russell Ballard told the entire membership of the church in his October 1999 General Conference address. He warned members to beware of false prophets and false teachers, and then he defined who those people are. They are those who declare that Joseph Smith was a deceiver. They are those who challenge the first vision. They are those who say the Book of Mormon is not an ancient record. He told the faithful plainly, in the Lord's church there is no such thing as a loyal opposition. You are either for the kingdom of God, or you stand opposed. Now imagine you are a believing Latter-day Saint parent. You have internalized that teaching your entire life, and your son or daughter sits you down and tells you they no longer believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. According to the words of an apostle speaking from the pulpit of General Conference, your child has just aligned themselves with false prophets and false teachers. Your child has just become the thing you were warned about. This is the machinery that produces the silence. It is not just grief. It is not just disappointment. It is a theologically engineered framework in which the person who leaves is automatically categorized as deceived at best and spiritually dangerous at worst. The church does not formally practice shunning. Jeffrey R. Holland denied it in a BBC interview. 2 BYU professors denied it at a public panel. But the lived experience of thousands of former members tells a very different story. One former member described a decade of silent treatment, followed by a superficial truce on holidays, and then being forbidden from contact entirely. Another reported that family members told them it would have been easier to deal with their death than with their departure from the church, because death would have sent them straight to the celestial kingdom, while leaving the church meant outer darkness. A bishop encouraged one woman's husband to divorce her after she left the faith. The church produces the conditions for shunning while officially denying that shunning exists. And that is perhaps the cruelest mechanism of all. Marriages that collapse under the weight. The Coates Cranny survey found something that should alarm anyone who cares about family stability. Among current Latter-day Saints, the divorce rate for first marriages was 18%. Among former members, it was 39%, more than double. And 20% of former members in the survey were still married to believing spouses, navigating a daily minefield of incompatible worldviews inside the same household. In LDS theology, a temple marriage is not just a wedding. It is a sealing ordinance, a covenant that binds two people for eternity, contingent on continued faithfulness. When one partner steps away from that covenant, the entire framework of the marriage shifts. What was once an eternal partnership becomes, in the eyes of the believing spouse, something temporary, something broken, something lesser. The believing spouse did not sign up for a mixed faith marriage. They signed up for a temple marriage with all the eternal promises that entails. The conflicts are predictable and relentless. Should the children be baptized at 8? Should they attend seminary? Should they go on missions? Should the family continue paying 10% of their gross income in tithing? Each of these questions, in any other context, would be a manageable negotiation between two adults. But in the shadow of a faith crisis, each one becomes a referendum on the marriage itself. The ward community does not help. Bishops offer counsel that almost always tilts toward the believing spouse. Friends from church begin to pull away from the couple. The social infrastructure that once supported the marriage now quietly undermines it, because that infrastructure was never designed to accommodate doubt. It was designed to reinforce belief. Some marriages end not because the couple stopped loving each other, but because the gap between their worldviews became unbridgeable. Others survive, but at a cost that both partners feel every day. The laughter fades. The intimacy diminishes. Two people who once shared everything now share a house and a schedule and very little else. Parents and children losing each other. But the deepest wound may not be between spouses. It may be between parents and children. And this is where the theology of eternal families becomes not a comfort, but a weapon. Consider the believing parent. They served a mission. They married in the temple. They raised their children in the gospel, drove them to early morning seminary, attended every baptism, every ordination, every mission farewell. They did everything the church asked because they were promised that if they did, their family would be together forever. And now one of their children has told them the church is not true, that the covenants they spent their lives honoring are built on a story that does not hold up. The grief is almost impossible to overstate. These parents do not simply feel disappointed. They feel terrified, because the theology tells them their child's eternal future is now in jeopardy. Their child is not just leaving a church. Their child is walking away from salvation. And the parent cannot help because the child does not want help. What remains is perpetual mourning, grief for someone who is still alive, still present, still reachable by phone, but who, in the parent's spiritual imagination, is already gone. Now consider the child. The average age of disaffiliation, according to research cited by Benjamin Knoll and Jana Reese, is 21. For millennials, it is even younger, around 18. These are not people making reckless decisions. These are young adults who studied their faith, found it wanting, and had the courage to say so. And what they discovered was that the love they thought was unconditional had fine print they were never shown. The love was contingent on belief. The belonging was contingent on obedience. The moment they stepped outside those conditions, the warmth began to withdraw. They are still alive. They still call on birthdays and show up at Thanksgiving. But something fundamental has shifted, and everyone in the room can feel it. The pain that nobody admits. Sue Emmett, who chaired the annual ex-Mormon conference, told NPR that leaving the church is like experiencing a death. Not a physical death, but the death of an entire paradigm that you built your life around. And the grieving process, she said, can take years. What makes this grief so uniquely destructive is the silence that surrounds it. Inside LDS culture, there is no established framework for processing this kind of loss honestly. There is no Sunday school lesson titled, "What to Do When Your Child Leaves and You Still Love Them." There is no general conference talk that addresses the grief of mixed faith families without steering the conversation back toward the hope of the wayward members' return. Instead, the pain is masked with spiritual platitudes that function as emotional anesthesia. We're praying for you. The Lord works in mysterious ways. You'll come back someday. These phrases are not offered maliciously. They are offered by people who genuinely believe them, people who are themselves in pain and reaching for the only comfort their worldview allows. But the effect is not comfort. The effect is erasure. They erase the departing member's agency by framing their decision as temporary confusion rather than a deliberate, considered choice. And they erase the family's grief by replacing it with manufactured hope that may never be fulfilled. This is the tragedy at the heart of the LDS faith crisis phenomenon. The very culture that produces the deepest family bonds also produces the conditions under which those bonds are most likely to break. The same theology that promises families can be together forever creates an environment where leaving the faith is experienced as a kind of death. And because the culture has no honest mechanism for processing that experience, the pain goes underground. It festers. It poisons. It turns holiday gatherings into performances and phone calls into obligations and love into something that has to be earned rather than given. The question that remains, the conversation that every Mormon family dreads, is not really about doctrine. It is not about the Book of Abraham or Joseph Smith's polygamy or the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Those are the triggers, but they are not the substance. The real conversation, the one that sits beneath every faith crisis, every tearful confession, every strained holiday dinner, is about the nature of love itself. If love only survives inside belief, was it ever unconditional? The church changed its policy in 2019 to allow civil ceremonies before temple sealings, partly in response to decades of families torn apart by the exclusion of non-member parents from their children's weddings. That policy change was a small step, but the deeper mechanisms remain. The temple recommend questions still function as a loyalty test. General conference talk still frame doubt as spiritual danger. The cultural architecture still treats those who leave as lost, deceived, or fallen. Some families find a way through. They do the hard, uncomfortable work of rebuilding relationships on a foundation that does not require shared belief to function. They learn to love each other not because of the church, but in spite of the distance the church has created between them. These families exist, and their stories are among the most hopeful in the entire ex-Mormon community. Others never recover. The distance becomes permanent. The silence becomes normal. Parents die without reconciling with their children. Siblings grow apart. Marriages dissolve. And the church continues to teach that families can be together forever, without ever acknowledging the thousands of families being torn apart right now by the very conditions that promise demands. And all of it, every fractured relationship, every cold Thanksgiving, every unanswered phone call, every marriage that quietly collapsed under the weight of incompatible beliefs, all of it started with one honest sentence. I don't believe anymore.